today's webinar. Before I hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb, our moderator for the day, I just wanted to quickly cover how to interact with the webinar today. You can't chat with us directly. However, you can ask questions via the questions tab on your webinar dashboard. So if at any point during the presentation you need to ask either a technical question of me or something related to the content that Laura will be presenting, feel free to use that questions tab and we will address those as needed or at the end, depending on what you're asking. So without further ado, let me hand it off to Melanie.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of AFRA, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar presentation on the crisis in Hungarian higher education. Before we get started, I want to reiterate a quick note on logistics. There will be time for Q&A at the end of this session. We will not take content questions during the presentation. We will save them for the end, but you can type your questions as they occur to you at any time in the questions tab to the right on your webinar dashboard. I'll hold those to the end and read them aloud for the presenter to address. Today's presentation is one of the products resulting from the first award from the Gloria Nathanson Research Fund for International Education. This AFRA fund was established in 2017 to support individual research projects in international and comparative education. It was named for Gloria Nathanson, who was a longtime active member of AFRA and NAFSA, and served as AFRA Vice President for International Education on the AFRA Board of Directors from 2000 to 2003. She also served on numerous task forces and chaired the International Education Standards Council, which is the body that informs the AFRA EDGE placement recommendations. And she did so until her retirement. The Nathanson Fund supports country or educational system research conducted by AFRA members in order to further the body of knowledge in the field of comparative international education and credential evaluation. Research results are shared broadly within the field. The number of projects funded and the amount of funding varies each year depending on the ongoing funding level to the program. Generally, awards up to $1,000 will be made to support travel expenses, research materials, and other direct costs related to research. Smaller requests may be more likely to be funded. The proposal submission form can be found online at afra.org. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Laura Parson, Assistant Professor in the Higher Education Administration Program at Auburn University. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Laura to begin our presentation.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I'm really excited to be here today, and I want to thank you for inviting me, and then also thank all of the attendees for being present today. This research is research that started, at least in terms of the idea for it, many years ago. I visited Hungary the December of the year that I was writing my dissertation, and while I was visiting there, I realized that I could live there. And less than a month later, I moved to Hungary. So I actually wrote my dissertation in Hungary. And while I was there, my dissertation wasn't international focused, but I really fell in love with the city. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with Hungary as a place. And I knew that I wanted to come back. One of the things that I was most particularly interested in was the Hungarian higher education system. Hungary is known for having really world-renowned mathematicians and scientists. And since my research focuses a lot on exploring STEM education and how STEM education can be more successful and also more inclusive, I wanted to go back and get an understanding of how Hungarian higher education works. Next slide. And so I planned a trip back, and my initial trip was funded by my department through our research fund. And I went ostensibly just to get an idea of the landscape and make some contacts. But while I was there, I quickly learned that the state of higher education in Hungary was changing and changing very quickly. because of the current administration, then current and still the administration today, led by Viktor Orban, there had been a major shift in thinking about higher education. And many, myself included, felt like these changes in higher education were reducing academic freedom and institutional ethnography. And some in particular were direct threats to institutions, passing legislation that would lead to those institutions having to leave Hungary and relocate somewhere else. And so I had initially planned to go to Hungary and find out, make contacts and sort of do an investigatory trip into what was happening in higher education. I quickly realized that my timeline was much shorter than I thought it would be. I thought I would come back in a year, but I recognized that in a year, the landscape of higher education in Hungary might be completely different. And so I needed to come back much sooner. And so as a result, I really made those contacts and found the AFRA Fund, which was a game changer for me. I wouldn't have been able to conduct this research if I hadn't received this funding through the AFRA Fund. And so I planned that research, and I went that year. I spent December and part of January there. And then I returned and did this research, which was an institutional ethnography in May of that year. Would have been May of 2018. And so my goal in this research as an institutional ethnography was to understand the institutional structure of STEM education in Hungary, but I really wanted to do two main things. And we can move to the next slide, please. To understand if there were similarities between some of the discourses and instructional practices and procedures that I had identified in STEM in higher education in the United States, but then also to understand how the unique institutional climate in Hungary impacted those discourses. So in institutional ethnography, and we can move to the next slide, please, the goal there is to understand how institutional practices, policies, and procedures are coordinating the work and day-to-day experiences of students in those programs. In this case, focusing on, especially through an institutional ethnographic perspective framed through feminist standpoint theory, understanding the day-to-day work of those that may be marginalized or underrepresented or minoritized in education, and understand how those institutional processes, procedures, and discourses maybe are coordinating or creating challenges for them. And so in this specific research, I thought to come back, talk to students in the program, and identify if and how these institutional policies, and that's both local, so within the institutions themselves, but also the larger institutional policy and environment in Hungary was impacting those procedures. And so thanks to the help of some contacts at institutions in Hungary, I was able to come back and speak to graduate mathematics students and faculty as participants in this study. And again, to specifically understand what their day-to-day work was and how that work, especially the work that maybe was creating challenges for them, was coordinating by institutional practices, policies, and procedures. We can move on to the next slide here. One of the things that I identified, and typically maybe would spend more time separating out findings and the conclusion or the discussion, but I think for the purposes of this presentation, it will be good to sort of situate the findings within the literature as I talk about them. And so looking at teaching practices and processes, this was my first time exploring graduate mathematics education. And so up until this point, I had focused a lot on undergraduate education, and it was interesting for me to see how some of these practices in terms of teaching and learning practices were different and similar. So some of the things that were mentioned by participants as challenges were also ones that were mentioned by undergraduate students as well. And so some of those are like mandatory course requirements. So students expressed frustration having to take courses that weren't aligned with their interests. This was expressed by graduate and then also related to undergraduate concerns in my prior research, but it was more salient for graduate students because they felt like now that they were in their master's degree, they should really just be able to focus in on the core area that they were interested in, and they didn't want to be taking their time away, their focus away on courses that they didn't see as relevant or pertinent. There were also concerns about required graduate level courses, but that they didn't have the prerequisite knowledge to go into. And that relates to some of these mandatory course requirements they're required to take these courses that they're not interested in and then maybe didn't have the prerequisite knowledge to be successful in. Other things that they mentioned as challenges was receiving delayed feedback. So in some cases, they would receive the final grade in a course a week or even a couple of weeks after the semester had ended and they had already started the courses for the next semester. So it was almost too late for them to sort of remedy that, address it, and understand what they needed to know to be better prepared for the next course that they were taking. And then the final one, and we can move to the next slide because these are related, is thinking about what it means to think like a mathematician. And one of the things that was really emphasized by faculty and students, and we'll be on the next slide now, please, was this idea that it was important to be able to think like a mathematician. So the idea that there was a way that mathematicians thought and that their training was teaching students how to do that. But when that wasn't explicit or wasn't made explicit to students, it just felt arbitrary, or it felt like they weren't getting the instruction that they needed on how they could be successful in mathematics education. And so these aligned with other discourses that were really prevalent across the field. And discourses, I think, especially when we're thinking about how work is being coordinated, that's what I'm the most interested in when we're exploring STEM education. But I found it to be very important here is that often these discourses are presented or represented in instructional documents or by faculty and the expectations that they set, but what they're expecting students to do or get out of that, or what those outcomes are, that information isn't always clear to students. And that's why being able to identify these discourses is so important, is understanding what it is that's motivating these practices, these requirements. And that's something that I seek to uncover in my research. But I also suggest that that might be something that is good for programs and faculty in general, just to make clear to students. I'm adding this requirement to an assignment because I think it's important that you learn this to think like a mathematician. So other things that I thought along with that were evident and came across in some cases as challenges for participants is this idea that ability was innate or fixed. And this was prevalent from faculty and students, this sense that like either they were good at math or they weren't. And even in the way that testing was done to get into the program, this is a really, for the most part, they really tried to be inclusive and to be as supportive as possible for students with different academic backgrounds. But there was still a sense repeated over and over again that even if they didn't have the background knowledge, that they either were good at math or they weren't. And so the testing was designed in a way to see if they were just naturally good at math. And so there's progress there, right? There's a positive sign that they're recognizing that students might be coming to their institution from a different academic background, and so then might not have the training that they wanted them to have, that prerequisite knowledge. But then that sense that they either were good or were not good. And that, I think, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but that can be problematic if we're not treating it as something that can be developed within that growth mindset and understanding that these things can be learned, that there's not an innate sense that someone is either good or bad. That can create challenges for students who come into a class and suddenly are struggling. They're pursuing graduate studies and perhaps mathematics has been easy their whole life, but now they're in this hard situation and environment, and it's hard and it's challenging. And so if the discourses are that you're either good or you're not, and then all of a sudden you're studying, the message that a student receives might be, oh, I don't belong, I'm not good enough. I thought I was, but I just don't have it. When in reality, they might just need to learn new strategies or perhaps seek outside help or different resources or learn about it in a different way. I think the other thing too, and this aligns with this ability, the ability as innate or fixed, but often the idea of passion and motivation being an evidence of a fit. So the idea that if something is easy or if you're really, really enjoying it, that's what it means to be successful. And that, of course, we want students to be passionate. We want them to be enjoying that. But I think sometimes how that's expressed by students is different. And so faculty might perceive that a student isn't passionate, isn't motivated, when either A, that's not how they express their passion or motivation, or B, they're working hard, they're challenged, and perhaps they're worried that they don't belong, and they're worried that by being too passionate or too motivated and then failing might be a threat to their internal sense of self. And so the idea that passion and motivation is important, but that simply not observing it in students isn't a suggestion that that student doesn't belong. And then I think the final piece, which will inform the next slide, is the idea that the mathematics knowledge itself was the most important and that the individual wasn't. That the individual sense or the person was not as important as the core knowledge, the research itself. And that informs kind of an understanding of how the Hungarian institutional climate impacted their experiences. And so one of the things that was expressed in the idea that the mathematics knowledge was the most important thing was sort of a general sense that, like, yeah, sure, there's a lot of crazy things going on outside aligned with like legislation and policy, and sure, it might impact them, but there was a sense that like this didn't matter, that the most important thing was the research, was the mathematics knowledge. And so even though these policy things, this environment might impact them, it might even make them have to move or leave the country or, you know, impact the very institution that they were studying at, it was the sense that there was a disconnect, that was happening outside of them, outside of their experiences, and perhaps wasn't as important. And I don't want to broadly generalize here. There were some that were concerned and recognized that these policy or that this legislation was a threat to the institutions that they were studying at. But in general, they didn't feel like that was what was important or what they were concerned about. Some other things that were challenging about the Hungarian policy and legislative climate was thinking about the visa and immigration process. One of the reasons that there were some threats to specific institutions in Hungary was Orbán's, I'm going to say, dispute with a founder of a major institution in Hungary. And as a result, some felt that that legislation was a direct target at the institution in a way to sort of respond to the feud with the founder of this institution. And so we saw across the country echoes of an anti-migrant sentiment, but then we also saw that the immigration process for non-EU citizens created challenges for those coming to study in Hungary, ones that weren't often mitigated, and because of perhaps a more hostile climate, it made it more challenging to sort of effect change for these students and to help them gain access. That being said, the faculty across the board worked really hard to create a community for students and to provide all the support that they needed to be successful there. And in many ways, this is where I found so many important implications in this research that helped to show how they were helping students to be successful. In some of my prior research, faculty had been reluctant to talk about a community and provide a community of support for students that would help them to be successful. And this was in contrast to the research findings that I found where participants reported finding the community to be an integral part of why they were successful in their program and why they wanted to be there and why they persisted to graduation. And in contrast, in this situation, students created and contributed to the creation of a community, but faculty did too. Faculty did that by always being available, always being supportive, making it a place where students wanted to be and they felt safe. And so even though the larger institution and then the larger climate and studying, being in Hungary might have felt very isolating, that wasn't the case in the institution or within the department itself. The departments themselves were being very supportive for students, and that mitigated the sometimes individualistic and competitive nature that can be seen in STEM and higher education programs. I will say, I think the final thing thinking about institutional structure was a sense from students that they just wanted more. They wanted more institutional support. And often I think sometimes that's something that can come across as needing more or wanting more options, wanting less more courses, wanting more elective choices. And so that is often limited by funds and things that aren't always seen by students. But I will say that that was an important thing that they mentioned, and one that also aligns with what others have found in my research about wanting more courses, more options. So we can move to the next slide, please. So thinking about why this research is important, as I mentioned already, part of this graduate education, in contrast to undergraduate education, there was this goal that they wanted to prepare future colleagues, future researchers, future people that they could work with. And that mitigated some of the impacts of a chilly climate that otherwise could have been there. Some that I mentioned, the individualistic nature, the competition, and even the idea that this was just very, very hard, and that was the nature of the program, that was the way that it was going to be. But because they were training future faculty, because they wanted to tailor things to specific students' interests, because they were trying to create a community for students, that mitigated some of the impacts of a chilly climate that perhaps I had observed in prior research. It did reinforce the norms of what an ideal mathematician looks like, though, thinking about what those norms were, and some of the stereotypes, especially when we think about gendered stereotypes, that we have seen in prior research. I think the final thing that I found interesting, and I want to make sure that we're really careful and we don't ascribe or place any label on the student as say, being insensitive to the policy climate that they were in. In many ways, I understand that. There's an element for me of writing, and when I get to sit down and analyze data and really getting embedded in the research, that even though it is connected to the real world, because that's the research that I do, I can sort of allow myself to almost get lost in those stories. And that's a very positive place for me to be, and it's an exciting place to be. I can sort of embed myself in the research. And so I don't think the students were insensitive, but I do think there was a pervasive, discourse that this knowledge was the most important thing, that providing this information, thinking about this, discovering these new things, this is what was important. And sure, there might be policy that might threaten, their ability to stay in the country or stay at that institution, or the institution might leave. That wasn't the most important thing or the most concerning thing for them. And I understand that. And I also think faculty were helping to promote this, in part because they didn't want students to be more anxious. They wanted students to focus on their studies. And so they were saying, hey, whatever happens, it will be okay. We'll make sure it's okay. We'll take care of you. And so that disconnect, I think, it might feel insensitive, but it wasn't. I think in some ways that's the way that faculty were hoping that they would feel. I think faculty were concerned, but they also felt like in the long run, it's the knowledge, it's the research, it's the discovery that's the most important thing here, and we'll do that wherever we are. And that was interesting and exciting for me. So I do think these immigration requirements constrain non-EU citizens. I don't think that that's unique, but what's I think unique about this study is how involved faculty were in trying to work with students. In some cases, a student, because of visa requirements, arrived to start studies a month into the semester, and they provided all the support that that student needed so that that student can be successful. And so there's a lot of positive things that I observed here, that while the discourses that coordinated what it means to be a mathematician and some of those instructional practices and procedures were the same in terms of prior research that I'd done, the faculty went above and beyond to provide support to students that helped them to feel like they belonged, helped them to be successful and have the academic support that they needed. And that's, I think, what was most interesting for me, and that's what I'm exploring as I move forward in my research, is thinking about how are these discourses continuing to be perpetuated in math education, and then what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the challenges that it creates for students? And then what are options for faculty programs to be restructured or to restructure their ways of approaching and working with students to be successful? And this research is really important as a part of that. So before I finish and open up for questions, let's move on to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about this fund and kind of talk about how this fund helps me to be successful. On my personal website, I actually wrote a longer post about the process of applying for the AFRA fund and some of the benefits to it, but I wanted to briefly provide an overview for them. So I applied for this grant, and it was actually the first grant that I ever applied for as on my own as a single PI. And so I had a low expectation for what would happen, but it really felt like this was a fund that was perfect for the research that I was doing. And one of the things I think I hear a lot from other faculty is how much work goes into applying for maybe smaller funds. And I'm going to say smaller with quotes that you can't see me doing, because without this money, I couldn't have done this research. But the reality is not only did this being a part of this fund, receiving this fund, allow me to do this research. I couldn't have gone if I hadn't received it, but the support and access that was provided to me after has been invaluable and has opened doors for me that I don't know that I could have imagined would have been possible. So I presented the initial findings from the work that I did at a international conference in December of 2018. My first manuscript reporting from this, and this was the research that I largely presented at the AFRA annual meeting earlier this year. That is forthcoming in an issue of CNU. And then the institutional ethnography project that I just described, that manuscript is currently under review at a journal right now. But in addition to that, the support, the connections, the community, even we had talked at some time, and I hope we can continue to talk about doing a regular podcast on international higher education. This access was invaluable. So I would say the way and the support that I've received is doing this. It's been so much bigger than just the dollar amount, although again, I couldn't have done it without it. And so I'm really grateful for it. And I'm hopeful that people will continue to support it and will continue to apply, because I just think the potential is really huge. With that, I'll open up for any questions.
Gosh, thank you so much, Laura. That was excellent. I will remind folks that if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Laura about the research or about her presentation, or have questions about how to apply for a Nathanson grant, feel free to use the question tab in the dashboard. Laura, I will ask the first question here. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you faced in doing international research?
Yeah, that's a great question. The challenges, it just depends on the location itself. I think one of the first ones is if you're going to an international location where you don't speak the language, that can create an additional layer of questions, and it requires you to think about the research that you're doing and how you're going to approach it. I speak Hungarian, not academic Hungarian, but that really aided me in gaining access to the country. And also some of the things that I needed to do was read through policy. And then also I needed to make sure that I understood the ethical requirements for doing research in the country. And so it was important that I be able to at least manageably speak and navigate by speaking the Hungarian language. And so that's something to think about right off the bat. If you don't speak the language, can you find a translator that can help you to do that? And how are you going to navigate to make sure that you can plug words into Google Translate and it'll give you sort of the direct translation, but what are the nuances there? What does that mean? And I think that goes to a larger question about research ethics and positionality. And this will vary according to the setting that you're in, but getting your institutional IRB board's approval to do the research is really the bare minimum in terms of thinking about the ethics of doing research and international research. And it requires you to be aware of your positionality. And if you're coming into a country, are your participants able to give informed consent to participate in the research, or are they being told that they have to participate? Are there additional ethical requirements at your setting or the country that you're in that you need to consider when you're doing that research? Are you truly informing participants about the research and supporting them and allowing them to respond as freely as possible? And all of these are things I think that you really need to consider when doing international research, and they're especially, I think, harder to determine or to learn about if you don't speak the language. And you have to do the extra work. You have to do the extra mile. It's on you, the researcher. It's not on your participants or perhaps the setting or the place that you're going to go to tell you when you mess up or what you need to do. It's on the researcher to really understand the environment, the climate that they're going into, the history of the people and the place, and even perhaps how research has been marginalizing. Find that information and then ensure that you are listening and that you are doing everything that you need. And I think in some cases, one of the hardest things is to realize that this isn't research that you should be doing, but to truly respect the ethics of the research, the ethics of the location and what you're doing, you have to accept that that might be an outcome. that no matter how good you think the research is and how interesting it might be, if you're not able to ensure that you can protect the participants perhaps from any harms that might come, or they can't give informed consent, or it doesn't align with the country's requirements for research, so this might not be research that you get to do or that you should do.
That's an excellent answer, absolutely. I can see that applying as well. Those were questions that when AFRA, my colleague Annetta Stroud and I went to Lebanon to do work in Syria. Those are the kinds of questions we had to address and consider in terms of making sure that we were approaching everything ethically and in a way that the participants would be both protected and understand the basis of the research. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will say one of the things that I learned just of like a personal nature is I so badly wanted the research to be a success that I would book my days from, morning to night, and I'd be running from place to place. And I'm very familiar with Hungary now, and so I can navigate it well. But I would often like not navigate or plan for like meals, or the fact that I would need to eat, or I would need to find places to do that. And so just there were times I had to remind myself, like, hey, your snack of the extra bag of Delta peanuts is not going to be lunch today. Like you need to plan and realize that you have to be at your best, especially when you're navigating a new environment.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions that folks have that they would like to enter into the chat box? If you have those, please do so now. And while we are awaiting any final questions, do you have any other final thoughts you want to share, Laura, or otherwise I will move on.
Yeah, I think the important thing for me is how everything that I've learned in doing this research sort of informs my next step. Really starting to think about why discourses are important was really evident in this study for me. And it really has directed what I'm doing next. And I've talked about this a lot, but there's an idea of there being an ideal math student, an ideal mathematician, an ideal scientist. And those ideals, and this is informed by AFRA's theory of gendered organizations, are often presented as universal. They're presented as something that is just natural. If you are an ideal student, it's obvious that you'll dedicate all of your time to being a student. It's obvious that you'll, be good at these things and that you'll have an innate ability and you'll find it easy. And those are often presented as just unquestionable, when in reality, those are guided by discourses that are often biased or race or class in some way. And so being able to identify how that's happening and how that is and how that might direct or create challenges for, in my case, and what I explore, specifically students, and what they might be challenged by, if we can identify that it's not natural, it's not something that is just a part of being a mathematician, but it's actually just one version, right? One view of what a mathematician could look like, and that there are other views and other options that can be just as successful, if not more successful. Identifying how those create challenges, and then creating options and opportunities for us to deconstruct and then reconstruct education and higher education as a structure. That's something that I'm really excited about, and that's the path that I'm really moving this research forward to do.
Very exciting. Great. Well, I think with that, we will close. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded or has been recorded and will be posted on our website. You'll be able to find that at acro.org. I want to remind you of some things that we have upcoming that you might be interested in. We have 2 other webinars this month. The first is an update from the Student Success Work Group on the role of STEM, and that is on October 18th. And of special interest to this group is a webinar on the Cambridge AS and A levels within the US context, what you need to know. And that will be on October 29th. Coming up next month, we have our Strategic Enrollment Management Conference from November 3rd till 6th in Dallas, Texas. I hope that I will see some of you there. The Winter Institute for Transfer Credit of International Education Records will be February 3rd through 7th, and registration is now open for that at acro.org. And finally, save the date for the ACRO annual meeting, April 5th through 8th. This year in New Orleans. And so I look forward to seeing you all in New Orleans. Thank you again for your attention, and we hope to see you at an upcoming ACRO webinar or event. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.